Hey, welcome back, American government class. It is Wednesday, hump day, October 21st, 2020. And it looks like we got a lot to do today, but we really don't. A lot of easy stuff. Let's take a look at this schedule. Today, we're going to start off with a 5-minute review. It's our first 5-minute review during this entire Constitution unit. So we're going to cover things like the Articles of Confederation and what we talked about last class at the beginning of our miracle notes. Next, and let's just handle this bad boy now, quiz week. Friday, we have class. It is going to be a quiz on Friday, all right? Weekly review quiz. It's going to cover everything from the Articles of Confederation to the notes we finished today. That is all fair game for the quiz. Going to give you 10 questions, as always. Give you 3 bonus questions, maybe. I always give you bonus questions. You'll get 3 bonus questions, and we'll move on after that. So make sure that you're paying attention, as always. You should always be paying attention, but make sure you're paying attention today. We got a quiz week, so a quiz coming up, weekly review quiz on Friday. Today, I'm going to give you a Founding Father introduction. We've been talking about all these guys, and if we were here in the classroom, I'd be able to show you what they looked like, maybe tell you a fun fact or 2 about them. I'm going to do that today, and then we're going to dive right in to our Miracle at Philadelphia notes, finish up that back page, and talk about the craziness that was the Constitutional Convention. After that, I'll hit you with the assignment and your attendance question, and we'll be on out of here. So, without any further ado, let's meet some Founding Fathers, shall we? All right, guys, a quick introduction to some of our Founding Fathers here. Now, you'll notice most, if not all, of these pictures of the Founding Fathers are painted because, of course, there were not cameras back in the day when they lived, so this is the best representations that we have. We're starting off, obviously, with the father of America, George Washington. Our first president was a general in the Army. He led our Army when we had our American Revolution against England. Next, this is Thomas Jefferson. If you remember, he is the main writer of the Declaration of Independence, the breakup letter that we sent over to King George of England right before the war, declaring our independence. He was also our 3rd president. This is the man who signed his name the largest on the Declaration of Independence, John Hancock. He was the president of the Second Continental Congress, that gathering of people from all over the country that decided to declare independence. He was also known for bootlegging and bringing in illegal items. Now here we've got a painting and an actor of Alexander Hamilton. The picture on the right here is one of the paintings of him that is widely used to show what he looks like. And then if you recall, over the past few years, there's been quite a stir over a play called Hamilton about this man's life. And this is the actor who portrayed him. Alexander Hamilton was a very young, very brilliant person who we'll actually learn a little bit about next class, but he was one of the main supporters of having that Philadelphia Convention to try to revise the Articles of Confederation because he knew they weren't working. And speaking of our Constitution, here is the father of the Constitution, James Madison. This is what he looked like. Again, a painting, but he was the father of the Constitution because, as we said, he took such good notes to make sure everybody was getting along and to make sure that he knew what everybody wanted. He was also the 4th president of the United States. And then this guy, you should know him. We see him on the $100 bill. That's Benjamin Franklin. He was not a president. Benjamin Franklin was never a president, but we know he did a bunch of things. We know the whole story about electricity and flying a kite with a key. He helped create the United States Postal Service. He invented quite a few things, but was also one of the founding fathers who helped America gain its freedom. And last but not least, the last person we talked about, Gouverneur Morris. Now, this is a jolly looking guy, but he's the person who wrote the preamble to the Constitution, and the person who we say penned the Constitution, as it was his handwriting that they say is on the Constitution. A quick backtrack here, just to go over where you may have seen some of these guys. Gouverneur Morris, not really anywhere. Benjamin on the $100 bill. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton is on the $10 bill. Thomas Jefferson is also on a bill, but a random one. He is on the $2 bill, the very often not seen $2 bill. And of course, George is on the $1 bill and the quarter. All right, let's go into a quick 5-minute review. All right, y'all, we're going to start a 5-minute review with a new twist today. It's going to be in the form of a PowerPoint, but you're going to see the question. I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to give you a second to see if you can get the answer before we give you the answer. All right, this is a great form of review for you as well. Whenever you're thinking about a test or a quiz coming up, you can always come back here or create one of these yourselves. I'll try to do another one later on in the year so that you get a little bit of extra help reviewing. Let's start it off and let's try to go quick to save you guys some time. First, what was the United States' first Constitution called? The Articles of Confederation. Why didn't the Articles of Confederation work? They were weak, like Mr. Finn. Give me 5 weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. They couldn't tax. Congress couldn't enforce the law. We needed 9 states to pass a law. Congress couldn't regulate trade, and changing or amending the Articles required all 13 states to agree. That was a tough one. Why was the requirement of 9 out of 13 states being present to pass a law considered a problem? Sometimes 9 states wouldn't even show up. They wouldn't send delegates. What does the word amend mean? Ooh, a vocab word. Amend or amendment. To change or add to. What was the flashpoint or event that led to Alexander Hamilton calling for another convention? It was Shays' Rebellion. What was the only purpose of the Philadelphia Convention? To revise or fix the Articles of Confederation. But what did they do in Philadelphia instead at that convention? They didn't revise the Articles. They created an entirely new Constitution. Who is considered to be the father of the Constitution? That good-looking guy, James Madison. Speaking of good-looking guys, who is this man? Think about the Declaration of Independence, $2 bill, Thomas Jefferson. And who is this guy? Benjamin Franklin. All right, that's it. Let's get into our miracle notes. All right, 5-minute review done. If you haven't figured it out yet, guys, 5-minute review is basically the quiz later on in the week, okay? Every time I give a 5-minute review, I'm asking questions that will guaranteed be on that weekly review quiz. I take the questions from the quiz straight out the 5-minute review. Just something to think about. All right, now, let's go ahead, get back to where we were on our Miracle at Philadelphia notes. You are going to need your Miracle at Philadelphia notes. These are mine. We're going to start on the back side. So, here we go. All right, guys, here's where we left off. We pick it right back up at characteristics of the delegates. If you want to take a quick look, this is what your Miracle Cornell notes should look like. We talked about what forms of government existed before the Constitution was written, the Second Continental Congress, and the Articles of Confederation. We talked about what Congress could do, and more importantly, what they could not do underneath the Articles of Confederation. We talked about the Constitutional Convention, the when, the where, the why, and about as equally important, the who, the famous people, the important people from the convention. And now, speaking of people at the convention, we talk about the characteristics of the delegates. Now, what is a characteristic? Well, it's a describing word. It's how you would describe somebody. A characteristic of Mr. Weckbaugh is that he's tall. Another characteristic of Mr. Weckbaugh is that he's bald. So let's talk about some of the characteristics of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention. First and foremost, they did have one thing in common with Mr. Weckbaugh. They were all old. With a few exceptions, there were some younger delegates, but for the most part, they were all very old. Second thing that they also have in common with Mr. Weckbaugh is that they were all white. There was not a lot of diversity amongst the founding fathers at the Constitutional Convention. And when I say not a lot, I mean zero, zip, zilch. They were all white. There were no Hispanics. There were no African Americans. There were no Puerto Ricans. There were no Asians. Probably most importantly, there were no Native Americans. They were all old and white, just white. And finally, the last part, where my ladies at? Well, not at the Constitutional Convention, because that's right, they were all men. Everybody at the Constitutional Convention was a man. That means that there were no women to help create the rules for our country. There were no natives, there were no other people besides white men who created the foundation and the Constitution and rules for our country. All right, I want you to stop right there for 1 second, pause the notes. We're going to take a quick break to discuss the characteristics of some of the delegates and the founding fathers a little bit more in depth. And really, it's a discussion that doesn't happen often in American history and American government classes. On the board behind me, you'll see a list of names. And you may very well know a lot of these names. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, John Hancock. These are all names of men that we've studied this year. Patrick Henry, John Jay, Richard Henry Lee. These are men that we'll study this unit in the following weeks. And all of these men have something in common. And it's not that they were founding fathers. They were founding fathers, but they also had something else in common. And that's that at one point in their lifetime, all of these men owned slaves. At some points, they owned more than 100 slaves at a time. The three men with stars on their names, George Washington, James Madison, and Benjamin Franklin, we know that they were all delegates at the Constitutional Convention. And in fact, of the 55 men at the Constitutional Convention, 25 or 26 of them, depending on the historical reference you use, 25 or 26 of them owned slaves at some point in their life. That equates to roughly 46 or 47%. 46 or 47% of the men who wrote our Constitution, the foundation for our government, the rule book that we still use today, 46 or 47% of them owned slaves at some point in their lifetime. And if you recall from American history class, you may have learned about indentured servitude. And this is not that. Indentured servitude would include some black people, some white people, and it would allow you to work in the same way that a slave would work, but to buy back your freedom. Slavery was not this. Slavery was all based on race. And in fact, the founding fathers moved away from indentured servitude towards slavery, all based on race. Now, there are a lot of historical scholars and teachers and professors who will tell you that this was the norm for the time. It was normal to own slaves, and that is absolutely correct. It was very normal. It was not looked down upon in that time as it is today. But what's odd about that is that of the 55 delegates at the Constitutional Convention, the men who started the Constitution with the words, "We the people," those 55 delegates that wrote the Constitution, a Constitution that was 4,400 words long. Of those 4,400 words, those delegates did not include the word slave or slavery once. All right, so now that we know a little bit about who the Founding Fathers were and what type of people they were, let's talk about how they felt about each other. Now, a lot of times you'll hear that the Founding Fathers were very at odds with each other, that there were two groups of Founding Fathers that went back and forth. And while that is true, they did not disagree on everything. It became very clear right off the bat that everybody was going to be in agreement of abandoning the Articles of Confederation. They all agreed on this. It was time to abandon the Articles of Confederation. They weren't going to get far as a country if they kept this as their first constitution. The next thing that they all agreed on was the type of government that they wanted to have. They felt that the government that they were about to create should be two things. First, it should be limited. And what does that mean? It means that the government can't do whatever it wants. They had just left and fought off a king who was doing whatever he wanted. They wanted to make sure that the government they created was limited and that they could not do whatever it wanted. And the second was they wanted it to be a representative government. We should probably spell the word representative right. Now, what does that mean? Well, we talked about this last unit. An indirect democracy. They wanted people to not have to vote on everything, but to vote for representatives who could then make decisions for them. And finally, when creating the government, they were very worried about power, as we just said. So they wanted to make sure that not one person had all the power. They believed in something called separation of powers. They didn't want power to be in one spot. So they created 3 single branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. These 3 different branches were all singular in that they were in charge of their own areas and had their own powers. However, they all worked together and had equal power, where not one was more powerful. All the power was separated amongst these 3 branches. Now, as we spoke about earlier, they did disagree on a few things. The first thing they disagreed on was representation in Congress. Some states didn't have a lot of people, so they wanted representation to be equal. A small state, or a state with a small amount of people like New Jersey, wanted to make sure that they had equal votes and not votes on population, because if they had votes on population, the people of New Jersey, they would never be heard because they didn't have as many people as other states. A second thing they wanted to discuss, because they disagreed on it, was how many houses of Congress there should be. If you recall, in the Articles of Confederation, there was only one house. It was unicameral. A house is basically a group of people who make the laws. One side said that they wanted one house. Another side said they wanted 2 houses. And what they did with these agreements and these disagreements is they decided to come up with some plans. They said, hey, we need some plans of how we should replace the Articles of Confederation. And the first plan that they came up with was known as the Virginia Plan. And the Virginia Plan was completely different than the Articles of Confederation. It was almost the exact opposite. First of all, in the Virginia Plan, they wanted votes for each state to be based on the state's population. Meaning, if you had more people, you would get more votes in Congress. That's why we call the Virginia plan the plan for the large states. We're going to bold that and underline it. That is very important. The Virginia plan is the plan for the large states, or the states with a lot of people. They said if we have more people, a larger population, we should get more votes. They also wanted a bicameral legislature, which we now know means two houses, or a two-house legislature. This was again different from the Articles of Confederation because the Articles of Confederation was unicameral. They only had one house. And finally, in the Virginia plan, they wanted a strong executive branch that would be chosen by the legislative branch, meaning those who were elected into the legislative branch would get to pick the president. This is very similar to what we spoke about last unit in Parliament, which is London's government, all right? In London's government, in Britain, they have a parliament, which is the people who make the laws, and then in the parliament, they get to choose the prime minister. This is similar to the Virginia plan. They wanted there to be a president, that's the executive branch, that was chosen by the legislative branch. If you recall in the Articles of Confederation, they didn't even want a president. There was no plan for a president. So this is, again, very different. The New Jersey plan, however, was very similar to the Articles of Confederation. They wanted equal votes of one per state, just like the Articles of Confederation. They said every state should have equal votes. That way the smaller states will be heard. That's why we called the New Jersey plan the plan for the small states. So go ahead, bold, underline that puppy. In the New Jersey plan, they also wanted a unicameral legislature. Very similar to the Articles of Confederation again. We know this means one house. And then finally, the New Jersey plan, folks, they did not want a strong president. They were worried that a strong president would be too similar to a strong king, which they just left. So they wanted a weak executive branch, but with a little kicker. They wanted the weak executive branch to not be one president. They wanted it to be a weak executive branch of 3 presidents. Could you imagine 3 different presidents right now? Take a look at our world now. Do you think it would be a good idea to have Donald Trump and Joe Biden and maybe Hillary Clinton, all 3 as presidents? Would they ever agree on anything? Would anything ever get done? Of course not. So these were the 2 major plans that were brought forth at the Constitutional Convention. A group of people came up with the Virginia plan, and another group of people came up with the New Jersey plan. And as you can tell, they are very different. They are almost exact opposites. So, what do you do when you and somebody else have a disagreement and you both think differently? Well, you come to a compromise. And what is a compromise? A compromise is when each side takes a little bit from their side and gives up a little bit from their side as well. The Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise, did a few things. It created a bicameral Congress. That means, as we know, 2 houses. That was the first thing it did. It said, we will create 2 houses. So that's where they take a part of this Virginia plan, the bicameral, and they put it right here in the Connecticut Compromise. And they say, we will have an upper house, a more prestigious house. That is the Senate. We will call it the Senate, and what we will do in the Senate is we will make sure that in this house there are equal votes per state. Now that looks an awful lot like the New Jersey plan, equal votes. They said, we'll have equal votes in this upper house. But to appease or make happy the people that want the Virginia plan, we will have a lower house. And we will call this house the House of Representatives. And in this house, to make the Virginia plan people happy, we will say that the votes will be based on a state's population. Meaning that if you have more people in your state, you will get more votes in this lower house. It will not be equal like the upper house. We're going to have a crazy number of people in this lower house, and it's all based on the population of your state. So if you live in a state with a lot of people like Virginia, you're going to have a lot more votes than the people that represent New Jersey in the House of Representatives. They will have a smaller amount of people. However, to make sure everything is fair and that all states can agree, for a bill to become a law, a bill must pass in both houses. If it passes in the Senate but not the House of Representatives, no dice. And vice versa. If it passes in the House of Representatives but the Senate disagrees on it, that bill does not become a law. And this was huge. And we call this the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise because they took pieces from both plans and they created this amazing plan of government to make sure that all states were represented equally. However, there were a few other compromises, not just the Connecticut Compromise. The one that we'll talk about now is the 3/5 Compromise. And the 3/5 Compromise basically said that 3/5 of slaves in each state would count for two specific things. In the South, there were a lot of slaves. So the southern states had a ton of slaves, and they wanted those slaves to count towards their population. However, the northern states said, "What, are you kidding me? That's ridiculous. You're treating them terribly. They are slaves. You can't consider them people towards your population. You are technically owners of them." So, what did they do? The northern states and the southern states compromised. And they said that 3/5 of slaves in each state could count for population. They said, that's all caps. They said, we will allow you to count them for population, but not as a full person, only 3/5 of a person. Meaning for every 5 slaves you have, you will get 3 towards your population. But you must also count them for taxes. Saying you can count them for population, but you're going to have to pay some money for them as well. The southern states agreed to this so that they could get more people in their population, and they were okay with paying a little bit more money so that they could have a higher population. And then finally, Congress was not allowed to prohibit slave trade until 1808. Now remember, if we scroll up and see when this Constitution started, 1787. And they're saying you're allowed to trade slaves up until 1808. That's basically 30 years. So again, these founding fathers, although they've said all men are created equal, they're not even denouncing slave trade. They're saying you can still trade slaves if you want up until 1808. Now, the last parts of this was that the Constitution, after this Connecticut Compromise, was agreed to by both sides. It was signed, and it was signed on a very important day. And I want you to remember this for the rest of this unit. September 17th, 1787 was the day the Constitution was signed. If you recall, this past September 17th, we celebrated Constitution Day at Precision Academy. And across the country, September 17th is known as Constitution Day. And if it sounds like I'm saying that date funny, it's because I am. It's the way I remember it. I always remember that the Constitution was signed on September 17th, 1787. A lot of like a snake. But that was the day the Constitution was signed. And once it was signed, it had to be ratified. And ratified is another good word to know. And to ratify means to approve. And it was approved when not one state agreed to it, but just like the Articles, when 9 of 13 states. 9 of 13 states were required to approve this Constitution for it to take effect. And once 9 states did, it became our new Constitution, a Constitution that we still have to this very day. All right, guys, there you have it. Congratulations. We are done with the Miracle of Philadelphia notes. Over the past 2 days, we've covered a lot of ground, knocked out a lot of information, so I am thrilled with the work you have done, as I am sure you are happy to be done with the Miracle at Philadelphia notes. For today's assignment, why don't we go ahead and keep it the same, do the same thing that we did last class. That seems to be working out for us. Why don't you go ahead and send me a picture of your completed notes from today. All right? That's going to be the back side or the second page of our Miracle Notes. Take a picture and send it to me. Whether you type it up on a computer or your phone, whether you print it out, or if you write out the whole thing, whatever you've been doing, it's been working great. Take a picture of that, send it in to me for today's assignment. For your attendance question, what I want you to email to me as soon as this video ends, let's go ahead. We're going to switch it up a little bit today, and I'm going to give you an opinion question. Now, what does that mean? It means there is no right answer, no wrong answer. It is just your opinion. So I want you to sit and kind of think about this one, all right? Use your brains. Don't just write down the first thing that comes to your mind to get it over with. I'm really curious to see what you guys have to say. And what I want you to do for your attendance question is I want you to consider the Founding Fathers and the delegates at the Constitutional Convention and everything we learned about them. And I want you to tell me how you would describe them. How you would describe this group of men who had a bunch of good ideas and made some compromises, but also men that owned slaves and considered slaves to be 3/5 of a person. Men who did not have any women at the Constitutional Convention as delegates, or minorities. Men who did not use the word slavery one time in the Constitution. Men who did not allow women the right to vote in the Constitution. I want you to think about all of those things we learned, and I want you to tell me how you would describe them. It can be a sentence, it can be 2 sentences, it can be shorter than that. I just want to know how you would describe them. This is an opinion question as your attendance question for today. Email that to me as soon as this video ends. Can't wait to see what you guys think about the Founding Fathers. That is it for today. I'm here all day if you have any questions or need any help. Hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. We'll see you next class. Don't go anywhere just yet. Quick note, all these pictures that you've been seeing at the beginning and the end of the most recent videos is called Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where both the Declaration of Independence was written and signed, as well as the Constitution. All right, now you can leave.